Hi, I'm Green Time host Don Fitz, and I'm here with Kay Drey this episode talking about challenging nuclear power. Kay is with Beyond Nuclear and has been working on nuclear issues in Missouri since 1974. Kay, before the break, we were just talking about the movie The China Syndrome. Now, what happened in 1979? 3 Mile Island happened right after that movie, and how do you think it affected people's attitudes?
Well, I think people were certainly concerned. It was terrifying, and I remember, somebody called me very early in the morning and told me there was an accident in Pennsylvania. And then I had just been in communication with a really brilliant guy named Earl Gulbranson, who's deceased, but he had been concerned about the fuel rods and what the metal is that holds the fuel rods. It's called zirconium.
Yeah.
And he said when zirconium is in a certain kind, exposed to water and steam and so forth, it gives off hydrogen. And he was very concerned, this was way before 3 Mile Island, about the potential for a hydrogen explosion. And as 3 Mile Island progressed, as it began, I started, early in the morning, I called the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to tell them, are they worrying about hydrogen? And sure enough, they had this hydrogen bubble. And the public was paying a lot of attention to the computer, to the television, and it was before the days of the computer popularity. And people were very concerned, and the governor of Pennsylvania wasn't certain whether he should tell people to evacuate.
I remember that they were not evacuating at a time that a lot of people said they should be evacuating.
Right.
Now, one of the things that came out after 3 Mile Island was that people said over and over again, nobody died at 3 Mile Island, and there really wasn't very much damage that happened there except to the nuclear reactor. Do you think that's an accurate perception?
I think there were a lot of things that went on. It's very hard when somebody gets cancer, maybe 20 years after exposure, it doesn't come with a little flag that says this was caused because of 3 Mile Island releases and all. But there were some local people who lived near the 3 Mile Island plant who went door to door and found out about all kinds of animals and plants.
I remember reading some of the stories of people, they couldn't evacuate their animals in time, and they came back and they would find their animals with their eyes burned out.
Or the calves, a calf would be born with 2 heads, and plants were strange, and people. We were very lucky with 3 Mile Island because, in one way, the reactor was brand new. That power plant was brand new. It only had been operating for 1 year. In fact, one of the workers who came that morning and saw all these cars and they saw media people, he thought they were celebrating the first anniversary for the second reactor at 3 Mile Island.
And they don't get to be safer as time goes on, do they?
No, but it turned out, though, it had so many mistakes its first year of operation that it really only operated for 3 months. So the fuel inside the 3 Mile Island reactor was not as dangerous as it could have been if it had been operating for longer, like a whole year even, or 5 years, or 15 years, or whatever. A whole lot more radioactive waste and gases and particulate material and radioactive water would have gotten into the environment. So in that respect, we were lucky that it was a brand new reactor with brand new fuel.
It did not have a meltdown there, but it was potentially...
It did melt. The fuel did melt. Even though it was relatively brand new fuel, it did melt. And then it melted, and this was after the accident. Then they wanted to clean up the plant, which is still a bloomin' mess. But the fuel did melt, and it got hard. And they decided they couldn't leave the fuel there because they were afraid it could have started fissioning again in uncontrolled chain reaction. And so they wanted to ship it out to Idaho to put into a swimming pool, which they did, and actually came through St. Louis with many trainloads. But in order to get the fuel that had melted in the reactor vessel out, and it was hardened, they had to chip it out. And there were some mutant microorganisms that thrived, and they couldn't see to do what they had to do because of these crazy mutant organisms.
Sounds like something you'd see on Star Trek. When it was happening at 3 Mile Island. Well, tell me,
and they had to pour peroxide in. They finally figured.
7 years went by between 1979 and 1986, And as I remember, we were told that that was just a fluke accident, that we really didn't expect that sort of thing to happen again. And then what happened in April of 1986?
Well, then we had the gigantic explosion in Russia, in the Ukraine, at Chernobyl. And it was just devastating. And there, too, the fuel wasn't as old as some of the fuel that we have, say, in our American plants.
It could have been
much worse.
And so as time goes...
It was terrible, and it's still, there are many people, they like to say that only 26 people died, but, you know...
The people who went into work to stop the accident from getting worse.
They admitted that they died.
Okay.
Some of them. But there are a lot of people beyond there, and there's still hospitals full of children who have major health defects, really, and
so do you remember the upper limit of what the estimates are of the number?
Well, now they're saying even as many as 1 million people, but I don't, and other people, those numbers, are just made up.
It's really hard because you try to compare the number of cancer deaths that would be projected without the accident with the number of cancer deaths that happened after Chernobyl,
right.
And you think, well, there were 1 million more. We think there were 1 million more deaths, but you can never be sure.
No one really can tell.
But it was a lot. But
tremendous sadness.
But we can say that it was a lot worse than those few people who died because they went into
Absolutely.
And what about the area around Chernobyl?
Well, it should never be lived in forever. I mean, the waste that the materials that are in the reactor vessel are going to be radioactive, some of them literally for billions of years.
Absolutely.
They're going to give off radioactive gases and particulate material and be hazardous. And the stuff that came out at Chernobyl, that landed on the ground, that land should never be farmed, should never be lived in.
And there was a quarter century that went by between Chernobyl and Fukushima in 2011. And the industry message was, we've pretty much solved the problem of nuclear accidents, and they really aren't going to happen anymore. But then, how did you? Do you remember things happening during that 25 years between 1986 and 2011?
Well, I have literally a house full of documents, and I've given many, many, many boxes of documents to the University of Missouri St. Louis Library. And there are many accidents that happen all the time. We're very lucky.
So in terms of accidents, when they say there's only 3, those are only the 3 that were meltdown level accidents. But other accidents happen constantly.
That could have become, very, very serious. And of course, what's happening now in Japan is just incredibly hazardous,
and
scary.
So this is in some, though there weren't the deaths of people going into the reactor afterwards, the amount of leaked radiation at Fukushima was even larger than at Chernobyl, wasn't it?
Oh yes, and it's not over, and we're, it's stuff has gone into the ocean, and Fukushima was just so sad because they had an earthquake and then this gigantic tsunami, waves, and those were frightening enough, huge 9.0 earthquake and stuff. But then it's not over, and we don't know what all is going to happen. And people used to say, well, what happened at Chernobyl is because the people they made mistakes, and people do make mistakes, serious mistakes all the time.
Okay, we have less than a minute left. Could you tell me what do you think is the future of the anti-nuclear movement in the United States and worldwide?
Well, it's very interesting. Germany, Switzerland, Italy, they're saying no more nuclear power. And the last nuclear power plant that was paid for by Wall Street was ordered in 1973 in the United States.
73. So
already Wall Street has refused to have anything to do financially with nuclear
almost 40 years.
Power.
Okay, so basically Wall Street's not financing nukes, so they would have to be completely publicly financed.
Right, by the federal government through loan guarantees or...
Kay, I'm getting the sign that we're about out of time. I want to thank you very much for coming once again to Green Time. I want to thank everybody for tuning in, and see us next episode. Okay.
It's very hard after working all these years to only talk for a few minutes.
I
want to talk for 900 hours, but no one will let me.
I know, it's really hard. I was just talking to a friend.
And I am not I'm not a one-liner. You may have noticed.
Oh,
I'm,
no,
I'm a a 6-page response. Was it okay?
Yes, and we got through all the topics, which is.
Are you sure?
Well, oh yeah, everything that we had on the list, we went over.
Well, good for you, because you were pushy.
I
You
know.
wouldn't let me talk.